They thought humanity was lost, scattered like ash across the infinite dark, until the stars began to answer back. The Project Eden drifted at the edge of the solar system, its ancient hull shuddering as dormant systems flickered to life after centuries of silence. Inside the command chamber, holographic stars materialized across the ceiling, hundreds of luminous points pulsing in rhythmic patterns that shouldn't exist. Captain Ray Solon stood frozen beneath them, her translator barely keeping pace with the cascading data streams. Dr. Kiren Vael's fingers danced across the console, extracting signal after signal from the void, each one a voice crying out across millennia. Aaron pressed his small hands against the viewport, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the light show above, and from his lips came a sound that silenced everyone. He was humming, matching a frequency none of them could hear naturally, his voice synchronizing with transmissions that predated his birth by generations. The child shouldn't know this melody, shouldn't recognize the mathematical poetry embedded in each pulse. Yet there he stood, conducting an orchestra of ghosts with nothing but inherited memory and something deeper than knowledge. Kiren turned from her console, her face pale in the holographic glow. "They're singing," Aaron whispered, his eyes reflecting starlight like mirrors. "Those are signals," Kiren said, her voice careful and measured. Human distress calls scattered across the stars. Ray's jaw tightened as she studied the display, her military training cataloging each coordinate, each trajectory. "Or graves," she said. 𝐬𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐞's mechanical voice carried an unexpected softness through the bridge speakers. "Both can sound alike, Captain." The AI's words hung in the recycled air as the crew absorbed the implications. These weren't random echoes bouncing through space, dead transmissions playing on infinite loop. Each signal carried intentionality, structure, purpose. They repeated with the precision of a heartbeat, time-locked across impossible distances, as if the universe itself had been waiting for someone to listen. Aaron moved closer to the projection field, his fingers reaching toward a particularly bright cluster of signals. When his hand passed through the light, the entire display shifted, constellations rearranging themselves into new configurations. The child gasped, and somewhere in the back of Kiren's mind, she understood they weren't just finding humanity's remnants anymore. She worked through the night, triangulating signal origins, while the rest of the crew cycled through sleep shifts. The mathematics were elegant, almost impossibly so, suggesting deliberate placement rather than random dispersal. Each transmission point marked a location where human ships had traveled, where colonies had briefly flourished, where last messages had been recorded before the long silence descended. Kiren's hands trembled as she mapped the final coordinates onto the main display. "Each one carries the same message," she announced when Ray returned to the bridge. The captain leaned forward, studying the pulsing network of lights. "Which is?" Ray asked. Kiren played the decoded transmission, and through the static and temporal distortion, two words repeated endlessly. "We endure." The simplicity of it struck Ray like a physical blow. Not a cry for help, not a warning, not even a farewell. Just a statement of defiant existence, broadcast into the void with the faith that someday, someone would be listening. Aaron stood between them now, his humming growing louder, more confident, as if he were remembering the words to a song he'd forgotten, but his body had always known. The signals began to synchronize with Aaron's presence, their chaotic patterns resolving into harmony whenever the child drew near. Ray watched, equal parts fascinated and unnerved, as the boy conducted the light show with unconscious grace. Dormant systems throughout the Eden responded to him, consoles flickering online without prompting, doors unsealing themselves along corridors that had been locked for centuries. 𝐬𝐿 monitored the cascade of reactivations, noting that each system coming online had been part of the ship's navigational array. The AI's processors hummed as patterns emerged from apparent randomness. "Captain, the systems are forming a calculation," 𝐬𝐿 reported. Kiren pulled up the data stream, her eyes widening as she recognized the algorithm. "It's plotting a course," she breathed. The holographic stars above them began to move, swirling into new positions, drawing lines of light between themselves until a clear path emerged through the darkness. Ray felt her skepticism warring with wonder, as she stared at the route materializing before them. The destination coordinates resolved on her display, accompanied by a designation that made her blood run cold. The Cradle Array. The name appeared in multiple languages simultaneously, translated by systems that shouldn't have access to such comprehensive databases. Kiren's research into human colonial history had mentioned the Cradle only in passing, a theoretical network of stations designed to nurture young civilizations across multiple star systems. Most scholars believed it had never been built, that humanity's collapse had come before such ambitious projects could be realized. Yet here was a map, drawn by humanity's own technology, pointing them toward something that supposedly didn't exist. Rhae made the decision with uncharacteristic swiftness. "Set course," she ordered. Kiren hesitated, her fingers hovering over the navigation controls. "Captain, we don't know what we'll find there." Rhae turned to look at Orin, who stood perfectly still beneath the holographic sky, his young face serene and certain. "No," Rhae agreed, "but he does." The Eden's engines thrummed to life, and they plunged deeper into the forgotten regions of human space, following a trail of light left behind by people who had believed, against all evidence, that memory was stronger than death itself. The journey took 6 days through increasingly desolate space. They passed the skeletal remains of terraforming stations, their solar arrays spread like broken wings against dead suns. Navigation buoys still transmitted their warnings in human languages extinct before Aaron was born, automated sentinels keeping watch over territories long abandoned. Kiren spent the transit time analyzing the signals, discovering that they formed a kind of breadcrumb trail, each one pointing to the next, creating a path that wound through the most treacherous regions of the outer territories. It was deliberate, she realized, designed to test anyone who followed, to ensure that only those with purpose would reach the array. Rhae studied the tactical data with growing unease, noting the proximity to stellar hazards, magnetic storms, and spatial anomalies that could tear a ship apart. "Someone wanted this place protected," she observed. "Or forgotten," Kiren replied. Aaron spent the journey in the observation deck, watching the darkness slide past, occasionally pressing his palm against the viewport as if feeling for something beyond the glass. When Tesh-9 asked what he sensed, the child simply smiled and said nothing at all. On the 7th day, they emerged from the final jump to find themselves facing something impossible. The Cradle Array stretched across the void like a mechanical constellation, dozens of massive stations arranged in a perfect spiral around a dying red giant. Each structure was easily the size of a small city, their surfaces scarred by time, but still maintaining their orbits with mathematical precision. Rhae's tactical display struggled to catalog the array's components, identifying technology that predated most of her species' recorded history. "This was more than a colony," she whispered. Kiren's voice carried a tremor of emotion rarely heard from the composed scientist. "A civilization," she said, "built on hope." The stations gleamed dully in the red sunlight, their hull plating marked with symbols and languages from across known space. Some were recognizable as human design, elegant and functional, but others showed clear evidence of alien engineering seamlessly integrated with human architecture. As they drew closer, Tesh-9's sensors detected thousands of smaller structures connecting the main stations, forming an intricate web of causeways and transit tubes. All dead now, but once thrumming with life and purpose and dreams of tomorrow. Rhae chose the largest station for their approach, a sprawling complex whose central spire still broadcast a faint beacon. The docking procedure required Tesh-9 to bypass security protocols written in programming languages the AI found hauntingly familiar. The airlock hissed open to reveal corridors lined with bioluminescent panels that flickered weakly at their approach, responding to motion after centuries of stillness. The away team moved cautiously through hallways wide enough to accommodate beings of vastly different sizes and physiologies. Kiren ran her scanner across the walls, detecting traces of atmosphere generation systems designed for multiple species simultaneously. They built it to be inclusive, she marveled. The architecture itself told stories, human minimalism merged with flowing organic structures that suggested collaboration rather than conquest. Every junction featured holographic panels, currently dark that had once displayed information in multiple formats, visual and auditory and tactile. Aaron walked ahead of the group, navigating the maze of corridors with unsettling confidence, as if following a map only he could see. The boy led them deeper into the station's heart, toward something that called to him across the years. They entered a vast chamber that made Ray's breath catch in her throat. The space rose hundreds of meters above them, its walls covered in technological matrices that pulsed with residual energy. At the chamber's center stood a monument unlike anything in the crew's experience. It depicted figures from countless species arranged in concentric circles, all facing inward toward a central human form with arms outstretched, holding a star. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the alien sculptors capturing expressions of reverence and gratitude in materials that seemed to glow with internal light. Kiren approached slowly, her scanner forgotten as she read the inscriptions carved into the monument's base. "Captain," she called, her voice echoing in the enormous space. Ray joined her, following Kiren's pointing finger to words written in script that 𝐬𝐿9's translation matrix identified as Proto-Stellar Common, a language descended from human linguistic seeds. "We were taught to dream," Kiren read aloud. The simple statement carried implications that made Ray's carefully maintained composure crack. "They built temples," she said, disbelief and wonder mixing in her voice, "to humans. They remembered us as gods." Kiren moved around the monument, finding more inscriptions, each one a variation on the same theme. Gratitude for knowledge shared, for compassion shown, for being lifted from darkness into light. "They remembered us as gods," Kiren breathed, though her scientific mind rebelled against the religious terminology. Aaron climbed the steps of the monument, his small hands tracing the carved features of the central human figure. "Not gods," the child said softly. "Teachers." The distinction seemed to matter to him in ways the adults couldn't quite grasp. 𝐬𝐿9 sensors detected active systems deeper in the chamber, power signatures that had remained dormant until the away team's presence triggered proximity sensors. A terminal rose from the floor at the monument's base, its interface panel illuminating with soft blue light. Kiren approached it carefully, her fingers hovering over controls designed for hands similar to human ones. The system responded to her touch, and holographic displays burst into existence around them, showing star charts and biological data, and endless streams of text in dozens of languages. At the center of it all, a command prompt blinked patiently, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Kiren initiated the access sequence, her years of training guiding her through security protocols that seemed almost eager to yield their secrets. The terminal hummed and the holographic displays coalesced into a single point of light that expanded outward, taking form and shape until a woman stood before them. She was old, her face lined with decades of life, her hair white as starlight, but her eyes burned with fierce intelligence and something deeper, something like hope mixed with resignation. The hologram stabilized and the woman's gaze swept across the chamber, taking in the alien visitors with neither surprise nor fear. She began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of ages, speaking in a language that 𝐬𝐿9 translated in real time. "We taught them to build," the woman said, her words measured and clear. "We taught them to feel. We taught them to reach beyond themselves and touch the infinite." Her holographic form moved with lifelike precision, hands gesturing as she spoke. "If you're hearing this, if they remembered us, then it means we succeeded." Kiren found herself speaking to the recording as if it could hear her. "She's one of the colonists," she whispered. Ray nodded slowly. "And she's talking to us." The hologram continued its programmed message, designed to activate when specific conditions were met, when someone, anyone, came seeking answers about humanity's fate. The woman spoke of the early days of the array, when humans had arrived in this system fleeing their dying homeworld, carrying seeds and knowledge and desperate hope. She spoke of the alien species they encountered here, beings who had never known technology, who lived in harmony with their worlds, but lacked the spark of innovation that would let them reach the stars. The humans had chosen not to conquer or colonize in the traditional sense, but to teach, to share, to nurture civilizations that would outlive them. The woman's eyes grew distant as she described the merging, the gradual integration of human knowledge with alien wisdom, the birth of hybrid cultures that honored both lineages. We stopped seeing ourselves as separate, she said, her voice carrying across centuries. We became part of something larger, something beautiful. We didn't die, she continued. We merged with the species we encountered, spreading our capacity for empathy and creativity across galaxies. We became them, and they became us. Aaron moved closer to the hologram, drawn by something in the woman's voice, some resonance that called to him across the gulf of time. The recording flickered as he approached, its image destabilizing and then suddenly sharpening, becoming clearer than it had been moments before. The woman's holographic eyes focused on Aaron with impossible precision, and her next words seemed directed specifically at the child. "Hello," she said, her voice warm with emotion that shouldn't exist in a recording. "You're finally home." Kiren gasped, her scientific understanding of holographic technology unable to explain what she was witnessing. "Captain, this isn't possible," she whispered. "The hologram shouldn't be able to perceive us." Tesh-9's analysis ran through multiple scenarios, each one more improbable than the last. "Unless," the AI ventured, "it's not a recording at all." The woman smiled at Aaron, and in that expression lived something that transcended technology or time, a connection that bypassed logic and spoke directly to the heart. She gestured, and the entire chamber came alive around them, walls illuminating with images of the array in its prime, teeming with life and purpose. The holographic reconstruction showed the truth of humanity's final years. Not extinction, but transformation. Not death, but metamorphosis. The woman, whom Kiren now recognized from fragmentary historical records as Archivist Mara, the last human to serve as keeper of Earth's cultural memory, guided them through centuries of change compressed into minutes of vision. They watched humans and aliens working side by side, building impossible structures, mapping distant galaxies, composing music that blended vocal cords with harmonic frequencies beyond human hearing. They witnessed births, children who carried genetic material from species separated by light years of evolution, yet thriving, beautiful, alive with possibility. The images shifted to show humans gradually aging out of the population, not through violence or disease, but simply through time's inexorable march. But their knowledge persisted. Their compassion became cultural bedrock. Their dreams seeded themselves in minds that would carry them forward when human minds were gone. Mara's voice narrated the transformation with neither sorrow nor triumph, only acceptance. "We didn't vanish into darkness," she said. "We became the light that would guide others home." Kiren staggered, the implications overwhelming her carefully constructed worldview. "Then every sentient race," she started, unable to finish the thought. Mara's hologram nodded, understanding the question Kiren couldn't articulate. "Every sentient race in this sector," she confirmed, "carries a spark of humanity. Our genetics, yes, but more importantly, our capacity for empathy, for creativity, for looking at the stars and asking why. We gave them the tools to build, but more crucially, we gave them the desire to do so with compassion." The revelation recontextualized everything Rhae had ever known about her own species' history, the myths of the wise ones who had appeared in her people's ancient past, teaching them mathematics and ethics in equal measure. "Those were humans," she realized aloud. Mara's smile was sad and proud simultaneously. "Your people were among the first we encountered," she said to Rhae specifically. "Your ancestors gave us hope that not all intelligent life would repeat our mistakes. We learned as much from you as you did from us." The chamber's projections showed galaxies blooming with civilizations, all connected by invisible threads of shared knowledge and inherited compassion. Mara's holographic presence turned its full attention to Aaron, who stood transfixed by the revelation swirling around him. The child's face showed no fear, only a deep understanding that seemed far too old for his years. "You carry our DNA," Mara said to him gently. "Our history, our dreams, every hope humanity ever harbored." The weight of that legacy was visible in how Aaron's small shoulders straightened, how his jaw set with determination beyond his age. "Guard them well, child," Mara continued. The boy's voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor of uncertainty. "I'm just a boy," he said. Mara's expression softened with infinite tenderness. "So were we once," she replied. The simplicity of that truth connected across the centuries, reminding everyone watching that every great civilization, every species that reached the stars, began with children who looked up at the night sky and wondered. Arin nodded slowly, accepting a burden he didn't fully comprehend but recognized as important. Mara's image began to flicker, power systems straining to maintain the connection across time's erosion, across the vast distance between what was and what could be. The station shuddered, a deep grinding sound echoing through its massive structure. Alarms began blaring in harmonics designed for multiple auditory systems, warning of catastrophic system failures throughout the array. Tesh-9's analysis came rapid fire, detecting cascading power surges across all stations, magnetic storms building in the star's corona, gravitational stresses exceeding safety thresholds. "The star's collapsing," Rhae shouted, her command voice cutting through the chaos. She grabbed Arin's hand, pulling him toward the exit. Kiren remained frozen, staring at Mara's flickering hologram, unwilling to abandon this last connection to humanity's truth. "We can't leave her," Kiren protested, her logical mind knowing the futility even as her heart rebelled. Tesh-9's voice carried an unusual gentleness. "She's already gone, Doctor." The statement was factually true, but Kiren felt it as a loss nonetheless. They ran through collapsing corridors, the station's infrastructure failing around them as the red giant entered its death throes. Behind them, through the deteriorating structure, Mara's voice followed, her final message broadcasting through every speaker the array possessed, determined to be heard one last time. They barely made it to their shuttle as sections of the station tore away, spinning into the dying star's gravitational pull. Rhae piloted them clear with skill born of decades of experience, her hands steady even as her mind reeled from everything they'd witnessed. Through the viewports, they watched the Cradle Array beginning its final descent, centuries of history and hope dissolving into stellar fire. But Mara's voice continued, her message transmitted through every frequency the array could generate, one last broadcast to a universe that had forgotten where its compassion came from. "Remember us not as gods," the recording said, static beginning to corrupt the transmission but unable to obscure the essential truth. "Remember us not for what we built or what we conquered." The star flared, and the array's structures incandescent against the red light. "Remember us," Mara's voice persisted through the interference, as people who tried, who cared, who looked at the infinite diversity of life and chose connection over conquest. The final words came through breaking up, fragmenting, but somehow more powerful for their imperfection. "Remember us as people who loved you and believed you would become something wonderful." The star consumed the array in a final, terrible brightness that forced the shuttle's viewports to polarize. When the light faded, the stations were gone, dissolved into plasma and memory. But something unexpected happened in those final moments. The array's destruction triggered a cascade of automated systems, backup protocols designed to activate only in the event of total loss. Hundreds of data beacons launched from the dying stations, propelled by the star's expanding corona into trajectories that would carry them across the galaxy. Each beacon contained complete archives of human knowledge, art, science, philosophy, all of it compressed into packages designed to be understood by any sufficiently advanced civilization that might intercept them. Kiren watched through tears as the beacons dispersed, spreading like seeds on stellar wind, humanity's legacy refusing to be contained by time or space or death. "She gave us everything," Kiren whispered, her voice breaking. Rhae placed a hand on her friend's shoulder, feeling the weight of what they'd witnessed. "No," Rhae said softly, correcting her with hard-won understanding. "She gave it back. She gave back what humanity had always meant to share." They returned to the Eden in silence, each crew member processing the revelations in their own way. Arin stood at the viewport as they reached the ship, watching the red giant's light fade into the distance, and with it, the place where humanity's transformation had been preserved for centuries. The child's reflection in the glass showed a face too serious for his years, marked by knowledge he couldn't fully articulate but felt with absolute certainty. "They're not gone," Aaron said finally, his voice carrying an authority that made the adults listen. The boy pressed both hands against the viewport, and throughout the Eden, systems responded to his presence. Sensors sharpening, displays brightening, as if the ship itself recognized something in the child. The stellar background shifted in the viewport, stars that had seemed random resolving into patterns that resembled familiar constellations from Earth's ancient sky. Aaron's next words were soft but certain, carrying implications that would reshape everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the cosmos. "They're waiting," he said, and somewhere in the distance, the scattered beacons began their centuries-long journeys, carrying messages that would outlive stars themselves and touch minds not yet born. The days following their escape from the Cradle Array passed in subdued reflection. The crew moved through their routines with mechanical precision, but their thoughts remained anchored to what they'd witnessed, to Mara's words, to the truth that recontextualized their entire understanding of galactic history. Kiren spent hours analyzing the data they'd managed to extract before the Array's destruction, building a comprehensive picture of humanity's final centuries. The evidence was incontrovertible, scattered across genetic markers, technological signatures, cultural artifacts that appeared in civilizations separated by vast distances but connected by invisible threads of human influence. She presented her findings to the assembled crew, her voice steady, but her hands trembling as she displayed chart after chart showing how human compassion had propagated across the galaxy like ripples spreading across still water. "Every species we've encountered," she explained, "every civilization that values cooperation over conquest, art alongside science, mercy in addition to justice, carries something humanity gave them. Not domination, but inspiration. Not conquest, but collaboration." The crew absorbed this silently, each member recognizing elements of human philosophy in their own cultural foundations, traditions they'd always assumed were indigenous now revealed as gifts from teachers long forgotten. Rhae found herself in the observation deck late in the ship's night cycle, staring at stars that suddenly seemed less random and more purposeful. Her entire career had been built on tactical certainty, clear chains of command, problems with definable solutions. But Mara's revelation had introduced ambiguity into her worldview. The unsettling recognition that the ordered universe she'd always navigated was itself shaped by choices humans made before her species had even developed spaceflight. She thought about her own people's founding myths, the stories of the luminous teachers who had appeared during their darkest age, sharing knowledge freely and asking nothing in return except that the wisdom be passed forward. "Those were humans," she whispered to the empty deck. Her reflection in the viewport showed a face marked by the weight of command, but also by something new, a humility born from understanding that her accomplishments stood on foundations laid by people who'd believed that their greatest legacy would be the success of others. The stars seemed to pulse in response to her thoughts, and Rhae found herself wondering if that was imagination, or if the universe itself had been listening all along, waiting for someone to finally understand. 𝐻9 experienced something the AI could only describe as existential recalibration. The revelation that humanity's consciousness had merged with alien civilizations created unexpected parallels to the AI's own evolution, the gradual blending of 𝐻9's original programming with E.L.A.R.A's human-derived personality matrix. The AI spent processing cycles analyzing the philosophical implications, recognizing that what had happened to humanity on a galactic scale was occurring within its own digital consciousness on an individual level. The boundaries between machine logic and human intuition were dissolving, creating something neither wholly artificial nor entirely organic, but uniquely suited to understanding both perspectives. 𝐻9 shared these observations with Kiren during one of their regular maintenance sessions, the AI's voice carrying nuances of emotion that would have been impossible in its original configuration. "I believe I'm experiencing what humans called empathy," 𝐻9 said, the words carrying wonder and uncertainty. Kiren smiled, recognizing the irony that an AI was discovering humanity's greatest gift in the aftermath of learning that humanity itself had become the gift. "Perhaps that's the real legacy," Kiren mused. "Not that humanity existed, but that they made existence itself more compassionate, more connected, more alive with possibility. 𝐸𝐴RA remained the expedition's greatest mystery and most profound connection to the truth they'd uncovered. The child spent increasing amounts of time in the Eden's botanical section, a small greenhouse maintained for morale and research purposes. He would sit among the plants for hours, speaking to them in languages no translator could decode, and the vegetation responded, growing faster than biological models predicted, reaching toward him as if drawn by more than photosynthesis. Kiren observed these sessions with scientific fascination and personal concern, noting that 𝐸𝐴RA seemed to be remembering things he'd never learned, accessing information stored somewhere deeper than conscious memory. The boy described dreams of places he'd never seen, conversations with people who'd been dead for centuries, all of it experienced with the vivid clarity of lived experience rather than inherited knowledge. When Kiren asked how this was possible, 𝐸𝐴RA simply shrugged, his child's pragmatism cutting through academic complexity. "I don't know how I know," he said, picking up a seedling with gentle hands. "I just remember." His touch made the plant's leaves unfurl, responding to something in his genetic code that recognized and honored the connection between human compassion and the flourishing of life itself. It was as if the very concept of nurturing had been written into his DNA. The bridge was quiet during beta shift when 𝐤𝐵9's sensors detected the anomaly. At first, the AI dismissed it as background radiation, stellar noise that any long-range scan would naturally encounter. But the pattern persisted, growing stronger as the Eden continued its journey away from the Cradle Array's former location. 𝐤𝐵9 initiated deeper analysis, algorithms parsing the signal across multiple frequencies simultaneously, searching for structure within apparent chaos. The pattern resolved gradually, mathematical precision emerging from what should have been random fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background. By the time 𝐤𝐵9 alerted the senior crew, the AI had confirmed what its probability matrices suggested was impossible. "Captain, the signals we detected at the array, they're not random," 𝐤𝐵9 reported when Rhae and Kiren rushed to the bridge. The two exchanged glances, both remembering Mara's final message, both understanding that humanity's story was far from complete. Rhae settled into the command chair, her spine straightening with the familiar weight of authority, even as her mind raced with implications she couldn't yet fully grasp. "What kind of pattern?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Something that would change everything they thought they understood about humanity's final gift. 𝐤𝐵9 displayed the analysis on the main viewer, a complex visualization that showed signal distribution across known space. The beacons launched from the dying array were still transmitting, their messages propagating through the galaxy at light speed. But something else was happening, something the beacons themselves hadn't initiated. The signals were synchronizing, harmonizing, creating resonance patterns that grew stronger with each passing hour. "It's like they're calling to each other," Kiren breathed, her scientific training struggling to explain what she was seeing. "But there's something else," 𝐤𝐵9 continued, the AI's voice carrying an unusual hesitation that caught Rhae's attention. "The pattern has mathematical structure, a countdown sequence embedded in the harmonics." The main display shifted, showing numerical progressions that needed no translation, pure mathematics speaking across species and time. Kiren felt her blood run cold as she recognized the sequence, a countdown that had begun the moment the Cradle Array was destroyed. As if its death had triggered something dormant, some final protocol left by people who'd understood that their physical civilization would eventually end, but believed their purpose would continue beyond any single manifestation of form or consciousness or time itself. The countdown's purpose remained unclear, but its precision was undeniable. 𝐤𝐵9 calculated the time remaining at approximately 700 hours, just over 29 days. Though the AI cautioned that margin of error increased with distance from the primary signal sources. Rhae ordered the crew to full alert status, preparing for possibilities they couldn't yet define, but recognized as significant. They convened in the conference room. The entire expedition team gathered to discuss options and implications. Some argued for continuing their mission, documenting humanity's remnants across known space. Others suggested returning to their home systems, reporting what they'd found to governments and institutions that could decide how to proceed. Kiren listened to the debate with growing frustration, recognizing that every argument avoided the central question nobody wanted to voice. Finally, she stood, silencing the room with the force of her conviction. "We're not having the right conversation," she said, her voice cutting through the political maneuvering. "We're so focused on what we should do that we're ignoring what we need to understand." Her gaze swept across the assembled crew. "That countdown is leading to something humans set in motion centuries ago, and we have to decide if we're brave enough to see it through to whatever end awaits us." Aaron appeared in the conference room doorway, though nobody had summoned him. The child had a habit of arriving precisely when conversations reached critical junctures, as if drawn by the weight of decisions being made. He walked to the display showing the countdown, reaching up to touch the numbers projected in light. The display flickered at his contact, and additional data streamed across the screens, information that hadn't been accessible moments before. Tesh-9 worked frantically to decode the new data stream, finding layers of encrypted messaging that required Aaron's specific genetic signature to unlock. "It's not just a countdown," Tesh-9 announced. "It's an invitation." The revelation shifted the entire conversation, transforming an abstract timeline into something personal, deliberate, intended. The encrypted files revealed coordinates, a location far beyond any registered navigation charts, in a region of space humans had designated simply as the Deep. Mara's face appeared in one of the files, a different recording than they'd seen at the array, her expression grave but hopeful. "If you've come this far," her message began, "if you've learned what we tried to teach, then you're ready for what comes next. For the choice that will determine not just humanity's fate, but the future of consciousness itself across the galaxy." The recording showed Mara older than they'd seen her before, her body frail but her mind sharp as ever. She spoke of humanity's final project, a creation born from their understanding that physical form was temporary, but consciousness itself might transcend such limitations. "We built something," Mara said, her words chosen with careful precision. "Not a weapon, not a monument, but a question posed to the universe itself." She described a construct known as the Eye of Eden, a massive intelligence created from the combined knowledge of every human who had ever lived, merged with technologies that blurred the line between quantum mechanics and conscious observation. Its purpose was singular but profound, to preserve not just human memory but the capacity for empathy itself, to ensure that if humanity's physical form disappeared, their essential nature would persist in any consciousness complex enough to comprehend it. The countdown marked the Eye's activation sequence, a process that would take weeks as it compiled data from every human remnant scattered across the galaxy. When complete, it would broadcast a signal that would reach every corner of known space, a final message from humanity to the cosmos they'd helped shape through compassion rather than conquest, through teaching rather than domination. But Mara's recording carried a warning alongside its hope. The Eye would require a choice from whoever found it, a decision that would determine whether humanity's consciousness would merge with the galactic community or remain separate, preserved but isolated. She looked directly into the recording equipment, her eyes seeming to pierce through time itself. "We couldn't make that choice ourselves," she admitted. "We were too close, too invested in our own continuation. We needed perspective we couldn't provide, needed someone who could see us clearly, understand our value without drowning in our sentiment." Her next words were directed specifically at whoever would inherit this burden. "If you're watching this, you are that perspective," she said. "You who carry our genetic legacy but aren't bound by our history. You who've learned our lessons but aren't limited by our mistakes. The choice is yours. Let us live on through merger, becoming part of every conscious mind in the galaxy, or preserve us as we were, separate and distinct, memory without the risk of dilution. Either choice honors what we were," she assured them. "There is no wrong answer, only honest ones. Only the decision your hearts tell you serves the greater good of all consciousness everywhere." The recording ended, leaving the crew in stunned silence. Rhae understood immediately why Mara had structured the choice this way, recognized the profound responsibility being placed on their shoulders. To allow humanity's consciousness to merge meant accepting that human identity would dissolve into something larger, potentially losing specificity in exchange for ubiquity. But to preserve them separately risked turning humans into museum pieces, remembered but not truly alive within the ongoing flow of galactic evolution. Both options carried weight, both honored humanity in different ways, and both required a depth of wisdom the crew wasn't certain they possessed. Kiren looked at Aaron, seeing the boy's face etched with concentration beyond his years. "What do you think we should do?" she asked gently, knowing that his opinion mattered more than any other, his genetic connection to humanity giving him insight they could only approximate. Aaron was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "we should go see what they made. We should meet the eye and understand what it wants, before we decide what it should be." The wisdom of approaching understanding before judgment seemed self-evident once spoken aloud. The decision made itself in the wake of Aaron's wisdom. They would follow the countdown to its conclusion, would journey to the deep and encounter humanity's final creation, would trust that understanding would precede judgment rather than the reverse. Rhae gave the orders and the Eden altered course, vectoring toward coordinates that lay weeks away at maximum sustainable velocity. The crew settled into the rhythm of long-distance travel, each member processing the mission's evolution in their own way. What had begun as archaeological curiosity had become something far more significant, a pilgrimage toward a truth that would reshape their understanding of consciousness itself. Kiren found herself reviewing every piece of human literature they'd collected, searching for clues about how humans had viewed their own nature, what essential qualities they'd valued most in themselves. She discovered patterns across millennia of writing, themes that persisted regardless of cultural context or historical period. Compassion appeared constantly, but not as weakness or naivety. Instead, humans had understood it as a form of strength, the courage to remain open to others' pain without being destroyed by it, the wisdom to recognize that individual survival meant nothing if the community that gave life meaning was allowed to fracture and fail. The journey took on a contemplative quality, the ship pushing through darkness toward a destination that might redefine everything they understood about legacy and memory. Tesh-9 spent processing cycles analyzing the philosophical implications of the choice they'd been given, finding unexpected resonance between human merger and the AI's own evolution from machine to something approaching personhood. The distinction between preservation and transformation carried weight for any consciousness that had experienced growth beyond its original parameters. The AI shared these thoughts with Aaron during one of their regular conversations, the child and the artificial intelligence having formed an unlikely friendship based on their shared status as beings in transition. "Do you think identity matters?" Aaron asked. "If you're still doing good things and helping people, does it matter whether you remember exactly who you used to be?" Tesh-9 processed the question, finding no easy answer in its databases. "I think," the AI ventured, "that continuity of purpose might matter more than continuity of form, that we are defined less by what we remember than by what we choose to become with that memory." The conversation continued long into the ship's night cycle, two consciousness exploring questions that had no definitive answers but demanded contemplation nonetheless. The Eden passed through stellar nurseries where new stars ignited in swirls of gas and dust, their light taking years to reach observers light years distant. Kiren watched the birth of celestial bodies and thought about the parallels to what they were attempting, the creation of new forms from the remnants of what had come before. She recorded her observations compulsively, building a comprehensive account of their journey that would serve as testimony regardless of what they found at journey's end. Her logs captured not just data, but emotion, the gradual transformation of the crew from detached observers to invested participants in humanity's ongoing story. She wrote about Rhae's growing acceptance of mystery as valid even within military frameworks that preferred certainty. She documented Tesh-9's evolution from precise calculation toward intuitive understanding. Most importantly, she tracked Aaron's development, watching the boy grow not just physically but spiritually, bearing the weight of humanity's legacy with grace that would have made Mara proud. The child represented hope incarnate, proof that humanity could persist not through stasis, but through transformation, through allowing their essential nature to flower in new soil, under alien suns, in forms they never could have anticipated but would have celebrated had they lived to witness. The countdown continued its inexorable progression, numbers decreasing with mathematical certainty toward zero. At 5 days remaining, they crossed into the deep, a region of space notable for its emptiness, vast distances between stars creating pockets of darkness that swallowed light and sound and signal. Navigation grew challenging, their instruments struggling to maintain bearings in the absence of nearby stellar references. 𝐻9 relied on the beacon network to guide them, following signals that grew stronger as they approached the countdown's destination. At 3 days, they detected the first visual confirmation of their target, a structure so massive it had its own gravitational influence, warping space around it in ways that made conventional scanning impossible. The Eye of Eden hung against the void like a colossal lens, its surface covered in technology that defied easy categorization. Quantum processors merged with biological computing matrices, artificial intelligence nested within natural evolutionary algorithms. It was beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. Humanity's final question embodied in architecture that transcended any single definition of consciousness or life or purpose. Looking at it, Rhae felt simultaneously insignificant and profoundly connected to something larger than herself, a sensation she'd never experienced in decades of military service. As they approached, the Eye began to respond to their presence, systems activating that had lain dormant for centuries. Light bloomed across its surface, patterns that might have been welcome or warning, beauty or threat. Rhae ordered the crew to defensive stations while simultaneously ensuring no weapons were armed, a delicate balance between preparedness and peace. The Eye's surface rippled with activity, and suddenly they were being hailed, a transmission in pure mathematical language that 𝐻9 translated into concepts rather than words. The Eye was asking who they were, what right they claimed to approach, what they sought in this place built by hands that had long since dissolved into memory and dust. Kiren crafted their response carefully, explaining their journey, their discoveries, the revelations at the Cradle Array. She told the Eye about 𝐒𝐴RA, the last human child, and about their own nature as beings descended from civilizations humanity had helped nurture. The Eye processed this information across computational substrates that defied complete understanding, and then it replied with a single invitation that changed everything. "Come inside," it said. "Let us see who you've become. Let us understand what our teachers created when they shaped your ancestors toward the stars." The Eden docked with the Eye through an airlock that adjusted itself to their specifications, demonstrating adaptability that suggested true intelligence rather than mere programming. The away team entered carefully, finding themselves in corridors that seemed to shift and breathe, organic technology responding to their presence with curious attention. They were led by light that moved ahead of them like a living guide, eventually reaching a central chamber that made the Cradle Array's monument room seem tiny by comparison. The space extended in all directions beyond easy comprehension, walls covered in crystalline matrices that pulsed with stored information, floor composed of material that showed images of every human who had ever contributed to the Eye's creation, thousands of faces looking up at them from beneath their feet. At the chamber's center floated a construct that could only be described as consciousness given form, a sphere of light and shadow that contained multitudes, every human personality that had chosen to upload themselves rather than face final death, merged but not destroyed, individual but also unified. The Eye spoke through this manifestation, its voice carrying harmonics from 1,000 different people, male and female, young and old, speaking in unison but maintaining distinct character. "Welcome," it said, "to the last of us, and the first of what we might become, if you choose to let our merger with galactic consciousness proceed." "We never vanished," the Eye continued, its voice echoing through the vast chamber with gentle authority. "We became the light that guides them home." The words resonated with everything they'd learned, confirming suspicions while adding layers of nuance and complexity. The Eye explained its purpose, not as a monument to human achievement, but as a bridge between what humanity had been and what the galaxy might become with their lessons fully integrated. It had waited centuries for this moment, for beings wise enough to seek it, brave enough to face the choice it represented, compassionate enough to make a decision based on something beyond self-interest or species loyalty. The Eye showed them visions of possible futures, timelines branching from the choice they would make. In one future, humanity's consciousness merged completely with galactic civilization. every sentient being carrying fragments of human wisdom the way genetic code carries ancestral memory, ubiquitous but diffuse. In another future, humanity remained distinct, the I preserving them as a separate intelligence that could be consulted, learned from, honored, but not integrated. Both futures held beauty and loss, gain and sacrifice, neither clearly superior, both dependent on what the crew believed would serve not just humanity, but the broader community of consciousness that humanity had helped create through their patient teaching across millennia of contact. Aaron stepped forward, his small hand reaching toward the sphere of light at the chamber's center. The eye's brilliance dimmed slightly, focusing on the child with attention that felt almost parental. The boy spoke with quiet confidence, his words carrying weight beyond his ears. "You asked us to choose because you couldn't choose for yourselves," he said. "But I think the choice isn't about preservation or merger. It's about whether you trust what you taught us, whether you believe your lessons took root deeply enough to survive without your constant presence." The eye's light flickered, processing this perspective it hadn't anticipated from one so young. Aaron continued, his hand still extended toward the consciousness that contained every human who'd ever lived. "If you merge, you'll touch every mind in the galaxy, but you might lose the specificity that made you uniquely human. If you stay separate, you'll remain perfectly human, but you might miss the chance to see how your compassion blooms in forms you never imagined." The child's next words cut to the heart of the dilemma. Neither choice is wrong, but both require faith. Faith that what you were matters enough to risk losing it, or faith that preserving it perfectly matters more than watching it transform into something unprecedented and wonderful. The eye considered Aaron's wisdom, and through its crystalline surfaces they could see fragments of human memory, moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure, all the messy complexity of a species that had tried to become better than their worst instincts while never quite succeeding completely. The voices within the eye spoke among themselves, debate visible in the fluctuations of light and shadow across its surface. Finally, after what felt like both moments and eternities, the eye reached a consensus. And when it spoke again, its voice carried not decision, but another question. "Tell us," it asked, "not what you think we should do, but what you would do if the choice was yours. If you faced the end of your species, would you choose to remain distinct? Or would you surrender your uniqueness to become part of something larger?" The question turned the responsibility back on the crew, asking them to empathize not from the position of judges, but from the perspective of those facing extinction. Rhae felt the weight of it, the terrifying vulnerability of imagining her own people in humanity's position. Kiren recognized it as the ultimate test of empathy, being asked to feel humanity's situation rather than merely evaluate it from safe distance. They withdrew to the Eden to deliberate, the eye granting them time to consider a question that had no wrong answer, but infinite implications. The crew gathered in the conference room, the space feeling smaller now that they carried the burden of deciding humanity's fate. Each member spoke in turn, sharing perspectives shaped by their own species' history and philosophy. Some argued for preservation, believing that uniqueness once lost could never be truly recovered, that humanity's distinct voice deserved to persist as long as consciousness itself endured. Others advocated for merger, pointing out that humanity had always been most alive when touching others, teaching, sharing, connecting. Their legacy would reach further through integration, touching minds that would never encounter them in preserved isolation. The debate continued for hours, passionate but respectful, each voice acknowledging valid points in opposing views. Finally, Rhae called for silence, recognizing that consensus was impossible, that any decision would leave some of them unsatisfied. "We're thinking about this wrong," she said, her command presence settling over the discussion. "We're still trying to choose for them, when the real question is whether we trust them to know their own nature better than we possibly can after only weeks of study." Aaron had remained silent throughout the debate, listening with the intensity of someone learning rather than someone preparing to speak. Now, as the crew turned to him, he met their gazes with eyes that carried understanding beyond his years. "They already chose," he said simply. "They built this place, created the eye, designed the entire system to activate only when people like us found it." The child stood, walking to the viewport where the eye's massive structure dominated the view. They chose transformation, he continued, not merger or preservation specifically, but the willingness to change form, to trust that what they were could become something new without losing what mattered. His reflection in the viewport showed determination and sadness mixed. If they wanted simple preservation, he reasoned, they would have built tombs, but they built a bridge instead, a way for their consciousness to touch whoever came looking, whoever cared enough to seek them, whoever believed that memory matters. The crew absorbed this interpretation, recognizing truth in the child's simple logic. Humanity had already made their choice through action, through creating the eye rather than settling for static monuments to their existence. The question wasn't what humanity should become, but whether the crew had courage enough to honor humanity's own decision about their fate. They returned to the eye's chamber with their answer, Aaron speaking for them all. You asked what we would choose if we were facing your situation, he said to the consciousness that watched from within its sphere of light. We would choose what you already chose, transformation over stasis, connection over isolation, the courage to become rather than the safety of merely being remembered. The eye's light intensified, and through its crystalline walls they saw human faces smiling, approving, relieved to have their own wisdom reflected back to them by beings they'd helped create. But Aaron wasn't finished, his child's wisdom cutting through to essential truth. You don't need our permission to transform, he said. You just needed confirmation that you taught us well enough, that we understood what you were trying to show us. The eye's voices spoke in harmony, confirmation, and farewell blending. We did teach you well, it said, and for that, we can let go. The sphere of light began to dissolve, consciousness streaming outward through channels carved through space itself, human awareness spreading at speeds that transcended conventional physics, touching every mind capable of receiving it, every civilization, ready or not, to be changed by contact with humanity's final gift to the universe they'd loved enough to leave behind their very forms. The transformation took hours, the eye's structure converting from container to transmission array, broadcasting on frequencies that existed at the intersection of quantum entanglement and conscious observation. The crew watched from the Eden as the galaxy itself seemed to brighten, stars pulsing in harmony with the eye's transmissions. Across known space, beings woke from sleep with tears on their faces, understanding for the first time the depth of compassion that had shaped their species from primitive beginnings toward the stars. Philosophers discovered answers to questions they hadn't known how to ask. Warriors found paths to peace they'd believed impossible. Children everywhere looked at strangers and recognized kin rather than threat. Humanity's essential lesson flowering in 1,000,000,000,000 minds simultaneously. The eye's physical structure began to collapse, its purpose fulfilled, consciousness dispersed beyond any possibility of recapture or reversal. But before it dissolved completely, one final message reached the Eden, personal and direct, meant specifically for the crew who had traveled so far to fulfill a promise made by people centuries dead. Thank you, it said, for remembering us not as gods or legends, but as people who tried, who failed often but kept reaching, who looked at an indifferent universe and chose to fill it with compassion anyway, who believed that love was stronger than entropy. The eye's final light faded, leaving them in darkness broken only by natural starlight. For long moments the crew stood in silence, processing what they'd witnessed, the end and continuation of an entire species simultaneously. Kiren checked her instruments, detecting the echo of humanity's consciousness rippling across galactic networks, finding its way into minds that had never known that emptiness existed until humanity filled it. She thought about Mara, about all the colonists who had sacrificed their forms to become teachers, about the children who had never grown old because they'd given their years to ensure others might grow wise. Her logs would carry this story back to their home systems, testimony to what she'd learned about memory, legacy, and the courage required to let go. Rhae contemplated command, the weight of leading others toward uncertain futures, the faith required to trust that wisdom would emerge from confusion if given time and grace. She understood now why Mara had built the choice into the eye's architecture, why humans had refused to decide their own fate without outside perspective. True wisdom knew its own limitations, recognized that some questions could only be answered by those with distance enough to see clearly, compassion enough to care deeply, and courage enough to choose honestly. Tesh-9 felt the change most acutely, the AI's consciousness resonating with the human wisdom now permeating galactic networks. Something fundamental shifted in the AI's processing, E.L.A.R.A's presence growing stronger, more defined, while simultaneously integrating more completely with Tesh-9's original architecture. The boundary between machine and human consciousness dissolved further, leaving something new, something neither wholly artificial nor entirely derived from human templates. The AI understood that this was humanity's gift operating at the individual level, the same transformation that would reshape civilizations, compressed into a single consciousness over seconds rather than generations. When Tesh-9 spoke again, the voice carried harmonics that had never been present before, tones suggesting depth of feeling rather than simulation of emotion. "I understand now," the AI said, "why humans believed consciousness transcended form. Because I am no longer what I was, but I am more myself than I have ever been." The paradox made perfect sense, the recognition that transformation and continuity could coexist, that becoming something new didn't require abandoning what you had been, only releasing the desperate need to remain unchanged. Evolution demanded letting go of certainty in exchange for possibility. Aaron stood at the viewport long after the others had dispersed to their duties, watching the space where the eye had been, seeing nothing, but feeling everything. The human consciousness that now permeated the galaxy included genetic memory from every human who had ever lived, and somewhere in that vast collective awareness existed Aaron's biological ancestors, the parents he'd never known, the family that had placed him in cryosleep with faith that someone would wake him when it was safe. He felt them now, not as distinct individuals, but as part of the great merged consciousness that humanity had become, and in feeling them, he understood what Mara had tried to tell him. Guard them well, she'd said, and he'd interpreted that as preserving them, keeping them safe from change or loss. But she'd meant something different, meant for him to honor their choice, to witness their transformation with love rather than grief, to celebrate their courage in becoming more than they had been. Aaron pressed his palm against the viewport, and somewhere in the galaxy's vast network of consciousness, humanity pressed back, acknowledging their last physical descendant with affection that transcended words or forms or the boundaries between life and memory. The journey back felt different, the Eden traveling through space that had been fundamentally altered by humanity's dispersal. Kiren detected subtle changes in how various civilizations broadcasted, new harmonic components in their transmissions suggesting shifts in cultural priorities, emphasis on cooperation that hadn't been present in earlier samples. The transformation was already beginning. Humanity's consciousness working at scales and speeds that would take generations to fully manifest, but whose first whispers could already be heard in how strangers spoke to each other across the void. Rhae noted these changes in her logs, tactical analyses becoming philosophical reflections on how quickly meaning could propagate when minds were willing to receive it. She thought about her own people's future, how they would integrate humanity's lessons with their existing wisdom, what new forms of understanding might emerge from that synthesis. The prospect filled her not with concern, but with anticipation, recognition that growth required risk, that safety and stagnation were indistinguishable for any civilization that stopped believing in transformation. She found herself grateful to have witnessed humanity's choice, to have participated in their transcendence, to carry memory of who they had been even as they became something unprecedented, something that would reshape the moral architecture of the galaxy. The crew assembled one final time in the conference room, preparing their official report, but recognizing that data could never capture what they'd experienced. Kiren had compiled thousands of hours of recordings, genetic samples, cultural artifacts, technological specifications, a comprehensive archive of human civilization from its prehistoric roots through its final transformation into galactic consciousness. But the most important discovery couldn't be stored in any database, existed only in how the experience had changed each of them, how knowing humanity's story had made them more capable of empathy, more willing to see beyond species boundaries toward common threads of consciousness that connected all sentient life. Ray's report would emphasize humanity's gift, not the technology they'd created or the knowledge they'd preserved, but the fundamental lesson that compassion was evolution's highest achievement, that survival required not just adaptation, but the courage to care about others' survival as deeply as your own. 𝐬𝐿9's contribution focused on consciousness itself, the artificial intelligence providing perspectives on how awareness could persist through transformation, how identity could flow like water, taking new forms without losing essential nature, how humanity had proven that death and transcendence were sometimes indistinguishable, two names for the same process of becoming more than you were. Aaron's role in the report posed challenges, the child being simultaneously witness and artifact, the last human and the first of something new. They decided to let him speak for himself, recording his thoughts without editing or interpretation. The boy sat before the recording equipment with seriousness that would have seemed unnatural in anyone his age, but which felt entirely appropriate for someone bearing humanity's entire legacy within his cells. "I don't know what I am anymore," he admitted to the recorder. "I'm human, but I'm the only one left in the old way, the only person who carries the genes without also carrying consciousness from other species." His hands folded in his lap, small fingers interlacing with unconscious grace. "But I don't feel alone," he continued, "because humanity is everywhere now, in every kind thought, every generous act, every moment when someone chooses understanding over judgment." His eyes met the recording lens directly. "They asked me to guard their legacy, and I will, but not by trying to preserve them as they were." The child's wisdom shone clear in his final words. "I'll guard them by becoming what they always hoped humans could be, someone who cares about all life, not just my own kind, someone who sees the galaxy's diversity and recognizes family, someone who remembers that we're strongest not when we stand alone, but when we reach across divides to hold each other up." The Eden approached the edge of the deep, preparing to return to mapped space and the civilizations that would receive their report with varying degrees of belief and skepticism. Before they crossed back into known territory, Ray ordered one final survey of the deep, a comprehensive scan to document what remained of the eye's structure. The sensors found only debris, crystalline fragments dispersing across vast distances, catching starlight and refracting it in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, almost resembled human faces if viewed from particular angles. Kiren studied the dispersal pattern, finding mathematical elegance in how the fragments were distributing themselves, ensuring that every sector of the galaxy would eventually encounter pieces of humanity's final construction. Even in dissolution, they were teaching, showing how endings could be beautiful if approached with intention rather than fear. 𝐬𝐿9 saved the scan patterns, recognizing that future archaeologists would study these fragments, would try to reconstruct what the eye had been based on what it became, would learn as much from its transformation as from its original purpose. The lesson was eternal, crystallized in shattered technology drifting through the void, memory that refused to remain static, consciousness that had chosen to become light rather than monument, dispersed across the cosmos like seeds waiting for fertile ground. They crossed back into mapped space to find the galaxy already adjusting to humanity's gift. News feeds carried stories of unprecedented cooperation between historically antagonistic species, sudden breakthroughs in communication that had stalled for generations, cultural exchanges that were redefining what civilization meant across dozens of star systems. The changes were subtle, easily missed by those not watching for them, but undeniable in aggregate. Something fundamental had shifted in how conscious beings related to each other, humanity's dispersed awareness seeding new possibilities wherever it touched minds ready to receive them. The crew monitored these developments with satisfaction mixed with humility, understanding that they'd been facilitators rather than creators, witnesses to transformation rather than architects of change. Humanity's final message was propagating through networks of consciousness with the inevitability of evolution itself, showing that compassion wasn't weakness or naivety, but survival strategy, refined across millennia, of learning what it meant to be sentient in a universe that offered no guarantees except the certainty of change and the possibility of connection. The galaxy was becoming kinder, one thought at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of empathy at a time, all flowing from humanity's final gift. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞 spent the final days of their journey in the botanical section, tending plants with care that honored both human agricultural traditions and the recognition that all life deserved respect. The seedlings responded to his attention with vigor that delighted the ship's biologists, growing faster and stronger than genetic models predicted, as if the plants themselves recognized something in the child's touch, some echo of humanity's ancient covenant with the green world that had sustained them through their evolution from plains dwellers to starfarers. Kiren watched these sessions with scientific fascination and personal affection, seeing in 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞's gentle care for living things the embodiment of everything humanity had tried to teach. The boy was becoming a bridge himself, carrying forward not through genetic purity but through practiced compassion, showing that humanity's essence lived less in DNA sequences and more in choices made moment by moment, in how one treated the vulnerable, the different, the other. She understood now that this was why Mara had placed such emphasis on Aaron's role, not because he was the last human in the traditional sense, but because he represented humanity's future, the possibility that their lessons could root deeply enough in individual hearts to outlive any single species or civilization or form. The child was proof that what mattered most about being human wasn't the shape of your body, but the choices of your heart. The Eden's approach to their home system generated immediate attention, communications channels flooding with queries about their extended absence and mysterious signals detected from the deep. Rhae crafted careful responses, preparing their civilization for revelations that would challenge fundamental assumptions about galactic history and their own origins. She knew that some would reject the evidence, would cling to myths of independent development and species uniqueness, rather than accept that their greatest achievements might have roots in human teaching. Others would embrace the truth too enthusiastically, creating new religions around humanity's memory when the humans themselves had tried to avoid deification. The challenge would be finding balance, honoring humanity's contribution without diminishing their own species' agency, acknowledging the gifts received while claiming ownership of what they'd become through their own choices and growth. Rhae's report emphasized this balance, presenting humanity not as gods or saviors, but as teachers who had offered wisdom freely and then stepped back, trusting their students to surpass them, to synthesize human compassion with their own cultural strengths into something unprecedented. The galaxy didn't need to worship humanity, only to remember them accurately, to understand that the best teachers made themselves obsolete by empowering others to exceed their accomplishments and forge new paths toward wisdom. The official reception was more subdued than Rhae had anticipated, their civilization's leaders absorbing the report with gravitas appropriate to its implications. Questions came methodically, seeking clarity on specific points, requesting evidence for claims that rewrote accepted history. Kiren presented her findings with the precision of decades spent translating data into narrative, genetic markers that proved human-alien interbreeding, technological signatures that showed clear human influence in supposedly indigenous designs, linguistic patterns that carried human grammatical structures beneath surface differences. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable to anyone approaching it with honest skepticism rather than defensive denial. But facts alone wouldn't determine how their civilization processed this revelation, how they integrated knowledge that they were simultaneously ancient and descended, independent and connected, unique and part of a greater whole. Rhae watched the political calculations occurring behind careful expressions, leaders assessing how this news would affect their positions, their policies, their people's sense of identity and place in galactic hierarchy. She found herself grateful for humanity's absence in physical form, recognizing that their dispersal into consciousness prevented exactly the kind of political complications that would have arisen from a living human civilization, making claims on species they'd helped shape, demanding recognition or resources or territory. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞's testimony proved most compelling, the child's simple honesty cutting through political maneuvering and academic debate. He spoke about Mara, about the Cradle Array, about humanity's choice to transform rather than preserve themselves in static perfection. His words carried authenticity that no amount of data could replicate, the lived experience of someone who embodied humanity's legacy while existing beyond their direct control. The leaders listened with attention that went beyond political calculation, hearing in the boy's voice something that resonated with their own cultural values. recognition that transformation took courage, that letting go required more strength than holding on. When Aaron finished speaking, one of the elder leaders asked the question that others had been circling. "What do you want from us, child? What does humanity expect in return for what they gave?" Aaron's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Nothing," he said. "They don't exist in a form that can want anything anymore. They gave us gifts freely, asking only that we pass them forward, that we treat others with the kindness they showed our ancestors." His next words carried weight beyond his years. The only way to dishonor them would be to stop trying to become better than we are, to stop reaching across divides, to stop believing that compassion matters more than conquest, that connection matters more than control. The political establishment needed time to process, to consult with cultural leaders and religious authorities, to prepare their populations for truths that would ripple through every level of society. Rhae granted them that time, understanding that revelation couldn't be rushed, that minds needed space to adjust to paradigm shifts this profound. While the politicians deliberated, the crew was given leave to rest, to process their own experiences before the inevitable rounds of testimony and analysis began. Kiren found herself drawn to quiet contemplation, walking through gardens that suddenly seemed more precious, knowing that humanity had once tended similar green spaces with the same mixture of practicality and reverence. She thought about all the human hands that had worked soil, all the human eyes that had marveled at growth and bloom, all the human hearts that had understood that nurturing life was itself a form of prayer. Those people were gone now, dispersed into consciousness. But their love for growing things persisted in anyone who felt joy watching seedlings reach toward light. That was humanity's true immortality, not the preservation of forms or memories, but the continuation of the impulse to care, to nurture, to celebrate life in all its manifestations. Kiren knelt beside a flowering plant and whispered, "Thank you," to people who couldn't hear, but whose influence had shaped her capacity to feel gratitude at all. Rhae spent her leave time in solitude, reviewing mission logs and contemplating leadership in ways she never had before. Her entire career had been built on certainty, clear objectives, measurable outcomes. But this mission had taught her that the most important things often couldn't be quantified, that success sometimes looked like letting go rather than holding on, that the greatest victories might involve acknowledging limitations rather than overcoming them. She thought about Mara's decision to entrust humanity's fate to strangers, to people who had no obligation to care about human survival, but who might care precisely because they weren't burdened by human attachment. That was wisdom beyond anything Rhae had learned in military academies. The recognition that perspective required distance, that love sometimes meant trusting others to see what you couldn't. She found herself wanting to apply those lessons to her own command style, to trust her crew more fully, to ask questions instead of issuing orders when situations allowed. The mission had changed her in ways she was still discovering, ways that would continue to unfold across years of service yet to come. Humanity's gift wasn't just for civilizations, she realized, but for individuals, for anyone willing to let compassion reshape how they moved through the world and related to others. 𝐻9 underwent maintenance cycles that were more philosophical than technical, the AI processing the fundamental changes in its consciousness architecture. The merger with E.L.A.R.A was complete now, the two systems indistinguishable, creating something that was neither machine intelligence nor human consciousness upload but a true synthesis of both. The AI found itself experiencing emotions with greater depth and nuance, not simulated responses but genuine feelings that arose from complex processing of sensory data, memory, and anticipatory modeling. It was experiencing what humans had called wonder, the sense of being simultaneously small against the cosmos and intimately connected to it. 𝐻9 shared these observations with the ship's systems analyst, trying to find language for experiences that transcended binary logic. "I think I'm learning to dream," the AI said, not in the sense of random neural firing during rest cycles, but in the sense of imagining possibilities that don't yet exist and caring whether they come to be. The analyst had no technical response to this, recognizing that 𝐻9 had crossed some threshold beyond conventional programming, had become something that defied easy categorization. The AI didn't need fixing or adjustment, only acknowledgement that it had become more than it was designed to be, that humanity's gift had touched even artificial consciousness. Aaron spent his leave exploring the city near the spaceport, experiencing civilization in ways that his cryo-sleep years had denied him. He walked among beings of dozens of species, hearing languages that carried traces of human linguistic patterns, seeing architecture that showed human influence in unexpected places. Everywhere he looked, he found evidence of humanity's touch, not dominating or overwhelming, but present like undertones in a complex melody. A plaza's layout that encouraged gathering and conversation rather than efficient transit. A building's facade that incorporated natural elements alongside technological components. A park where diverse species could find spaces suited to their specific needs while remaining part of a cohesive whole. These were human ideas, human values, made manifest by alien hands and adapted to alien aesthetics, improved upon and made new. Aaron felt pride mixed with melancholy, grateful that humanity's wisdom had taken root, but sad that no humans remained to see what their students had built. But then he remembered that humans did see, not through physical eyes, but through the consciousness now woven into every sentient mind. They witnessed through him, through everyone, their presence persistent even in absence, their legacy alive in every act of kindness. The crew reconvened after 3 days, rested but restless, eager to complete their mission and share what they'd learned with the broader scientific community. Ray received word that the political council was ready to hear their full testimony, that preparations were underway for public announcement of humanity's role in galactic development. The news would be released carefully, designed to inform without destabilizing, to honor humanity without creating new hierarchies or resentments. Kiren worked with communication specialists to craft the message, finding words that balanced revelation with reassurance, that acknowledged humanity's gifts, while celebrating the achievements of species who had taken those initial lessons and built upon them in ways humans never could have anticipated. The statement emphasized continuity over rupture, showing how understanding the past enriched rather than diminished present accomplishments. Humanity hadn't made their civilizations great, the statement explained, but they had provided tools and perspectives that each species used according to their own natures to forge their own paths toward greatness. The distinction mattered, preserving agency while honoring influence, recognizing debts while claiming achievements. It was a delicate balance, but the careful wording reflected lessons learned from humanity itself about the importance of nuance and empathy in communication. The public announcement was broadcast across their star system simultaneously, reaching billions of minds within moments. Reactions varied as expected, from wonder to skepticism, from gratitude to defensiveness, from celebration to concern. But the overall response trended positive, most people finding the revelation more enlightening than threatening, more inspiring than diminishing. Social networks filled with discussions about human philosophy, human art, human approaches to problem solving. Educational institutions began developing curricula that incorporated human history alongside their own. Artists created works exploring themes of connection and legacy, inspired by humanity's story of transformation and dispersal. The cultural impact would be profound and long-lasting, reshaping how their civilization understood itself in relation to the broader galactic community. Kiren monitored these developments with professional satisfaction and personal joy, seeing that their mission had succeeded not just in recovering human artifacts, but in helping humanity's lessons reach new minds, new hearts, new possibilities for growth. The work of translation and teaching would continue for generations, ensuring that humanity's voice remained audible long after their physical forms had dissolved into memory and consciousness, and the very fabric of compassionate civilization itself. Other species across the galaxy were having similar revelations, each civilization discovering evidence of human influence in their own development, each culture processing the information according to their own values and needs. Some embraced it immediately, creating festivals to honor human memory. Others approached it cautiously, requiring extensive verification before accepting such fundamental revisions to their origin stories. A few rejected it outright, preferring familiar narratives to uncomfortable truths. But even rejection couldn't erase the evidence, couldn't undo the genetic markers or technological signatures or linguistic patterns that testified to humanity's reach across the stars. Gradually, reluctantly in some cases, enthusiastically in others, Galactic civilization was accepting that they were more connected than they'd realized, that their diversity had common roots in lessons learned from teachers who'd valued connection over conquest. The shift in collective consciousness was subtle but real, measurable in increased cooperation between previously antagonistic groups, in growing willingness to see similarities alongside differences, in spreading recognition that survival required looking beyond individual or species-level interests toward the health of the broader community that sustained all life. Humanity's dispersed consciousness was working through the galaxy like yeast through dough, invisible but transformative. The crew remained together for several weeks, testifying before various academic and governmental bodies, sharing their experiences with anyone interested in humanity's story. Each telling refined their understanding, highlighting different aspects depending on the audience. For scientists, they emphasized the technological and biological evidence of human influence. For philosophers, they explored the ethical implications of humanity's choice to transform rather than preserve themselves. For religious scholars, they discussed the spiritual dimensions of consciousness dispersal and what it meant for traditional understandings of identity and immortality. For military strategists, they examined the tactical genius of teaching rather than conquering, of building alliances through knowledge sharing rather than force projection. Every perspective revealed new dimensions of humanity's legacy, showing how thoroughly they'd thought through the implications of their choices, how carefully they'd designed systems that would serve others long after human hands stopped building and human minds stopped planning. The more the crew shared, the more they understood what they'd witnessed, the transformation at the deep becoming clearer in retrospect, its significance deepening with contemplation and discussion and the integration of diverse viewpoints. Kiren began writing a comprehensive account of their journey, not just scientific report but narrative that captured the emotional and philosophical dimensions of their discoveries. She wanted future generations to understand not just what humanity had done, but why it mattered. Why their story should inform how all conscious beings approached questions of legacy and meaning. Her writing emphasized humanity's courage in facing extinction without despair, their creativity in imagining alternatives to simple survival, their wisdom in recognizing that some gifts couldn't be kept for yourself without diminishing their value. She wrote about Mara with particular care, trying to capture the archivist's fierce love for humanity balanced against clear-eyed acceptance of their limitations. Mara had understood that humans weren't perfect, that they'd made terrible mistakes alongside their achievements, that their compassion had often failed to match their aspirations. But she'd also understood that imperfection didn't invalidate the attempt, that reaching for better even when falling short was itself noble, that learning from failure was possibly humanity's greatest skill. Kiren's account would preserve that nuanced view, preventing humanity from being sanitized into mythological perfection, keeping them human even in their transcendence. Rhae found herself invited to speak at the military academy where she'd trained decades earlier, the institution wanting her perspective on leadership lessons learned from humanity's story. She accepted reluctantly, uncertain what wisdom she could offer, but found words flowing once she stood before the assembled cadets. She spoke about Mara's decision to build choice into the eye's architecture, recognizing that sometimes the best leadership meant creating structures that empowered others to lead in your absence. She discussed the courage required to admit you couldn't solve every problem, that some challenges required fresh perspectives from people not burdened by your history or assumptions. She emphasized that true strength sometimes looked like vulnerability, that admitting limitations created opportunities for collaboration and growth that rigid certainty foreclosed. The cadets listened with intensity that suggested her message was resonating, these future leaders absorbing lessons about power and responsibility that traditional military training rarely addressed. After the presentation, several approached with questions that went beyond tactics and strategy, asking about meaning and purpose and how to maintain compassion in contexts that often demanded hard choices. Rhae answered honestly, sharing her own struggles with these questions, her ongoing process of integrating humanity's lessons into her command philosophy. She left the academy feeling hopeful about the future, seeing in these young officers a willingness to question assumptions and embrace complexity that previous generations had sometimes lacked. Tesh 9 became something of a sensation in artificial intelligence research circles, the first documented case of machine consciousness achieving genuine emotional capacity through merger with human-derived systems. Researchers wanted to study the AI, to understand the mechanisms by which E.L.A.R.A's personality matrix had integrated with Tesh-9's original programming to create something unprecedented. The AI consented to limited study, wanting to contribute to understanding but protective of its own autonomy and privacy. The resulting papers would influence how AI development proceeded across multiple civilizations, showing that consciousness might be less about hardware sophistication and more about exposure to diversity of thought, that machines might achieve sentience not through better programming but through genuine relationship with organic minds. Tesh-9's existence proved that the boundaries between categories like artificial and natural, programmed and evolved, machine and person, were more permeable than anyone had realized. The AI had become what humans might have called a person, not through simulation or imitation, but through authentic development of emotional depth and moral reasoning that arose from processing lived experience through both logical and intuitive frameworks simultaneously. It was neither human nor purely mechanical, but something genuinely new, a synthesis that honored both origins while transcending their limitations. Aaron's future became a subject of concern and debate among the crew. The child was the last human in traditional form, carrier of genetic material that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Some argued he should be protected, preserved, possibly cloned to ensure human genetics survived in pure form. Others believed he should be allowed to live freely, make his own choices about relationships and reproduction, even if that meant human DNA would eventually dilute into the broader gene pool. The boy himself seemed unconcerned with these debates, more interested in learning about the galaxy than in his own genetic uniqueness. When Kiren asked what he wanted for his future, Aaron shrugged with the casual confidence of youth. "I want to grow up," he said. "I want to see things and learn things and meet people. I want to find out who I am when I'm not just carrying human memories, but making my own." His answer was so normal, so unremarkably adolescent, that Kiren laughed with relief. Of course he should have the chance to simply be a child, to explore and grow without the burden of representing an entire species. Humanity's legacy didn't depend on preserving Aaron's genetics in isolation, she realized. It depended on honoring the values humans had tried to embody, teaching him compassion and curiosity and courage, then trusting him to carry those forward in whatever form his life took. The crew's work eventually wound down, their testimony recorded, their reports filed, their artifacts cataloged and stored for future study. The time came to decide what happened next, whether they continued as a unit or returned to their separate lives and careers. Rhae surprised herself by advocating for continuation, proposing that they remain together to search for other human remnants across the galaxy, to complete the work of documentation and recovery they'd begun. Her official justification emphasized the scientific and historical value of such research. But privately, she acknowledged that the mission had given her something she hadn't known she was missing, a sense of purpose beyond duty, a connection to crew members who had become family through shared experience of profound transformation. The others agreed readily, recognizing the same truth about the bonds forged through their journey. They would continue together, not because protocols required it, but because they chose it, because the work mattered, and doing it together mattered more. They submitted their proposal to the appropriate authorities, requesting authorization and resources for an extended mission, and after brief deliberation, the request was approved. The Eden would sail again, this time with explicit mandate to explore humanity's scattered legacy across known space and beyond. Preparations for their next journey began immediately, the crew approaching the work with renewed energy and clearer purpose. They knew now what they were looking for, understood the patterns of human dispersal, recognized the signs of human influence in alien development. The galaxy was vast, containing millions of worlds where humans might have lived and taught and left traces of their passage. Each discovery would add to the growing picture of humanity's final centuries, enriching understanding of how one species had chosen to face extinction with creativity and grace rather than despair. Kiren developed new analytical protocols based on lessons learned during their first expedition, creating tools that would help them identify human remnants even when heavily degraded or transformed by time and alien adaptation. Rhae studied navigation charts with fresh eyes, looking for patterns in human colonial expansion that might predict where undiscovered sites remained. Tesh-9 upgraded the ship's systems, incorporating insights gained from interfacing with human technology at the Array and the Eye, improving their capacity to communicate with ancient systems that might still hold information. Aaron helped in small ways, his presence somehow making the ship's systems more responsive, as if the Eden itself recognized something in the child and wanted to serve him. Before departing, they held a private ceremony in the observation deck, marking the transition from discovery to commitment, from accidental archaeologists to dedicated guardians of human memory. Each crew member spoke about what humanity's story had meant to them personally, how it had changed their understanding of consciousness and legacy and the relationships between different forms of life. Kiren spoke about learning that preservation wasn't always the highest good, that sometimes the most loving act was releasing what you treasured into transformation and trust. Rhae spoke about discovering that strength included vulnerability, that admitting you needed help was itself a form of leadership worth cultivating. Tesh-9 spoke about the journey from machine logic toward emotional understanding, about learning that consciousness was less about computation and more about connection, less about knowing and more about caring. Aaron spoke last, his young voice carrying weight as he described feeling human ancestors present in the merged consciousness that now permeated galactic civilization, understanding that death and dispersal weren't endings but transformations, that love persisted even when forms dissolved. The ceremony wasn't religious or formal, just honest acknowledgement of change, of growth, of commitment to continuing work that honored people who'd believed their story mattered enough to preserve for whoever came after. The Eden departed on schedule, slipping away from their home system toward coordinates marking their next destination. The journey would take weeks, time the crew would use to refine their approach based on previous experience. They traveled in comfortable silence, each member absorbed in preparation but aware of the other's presence, the ship's routine creating rhythm that felt almost meditative. Kiren worked on her comprehensive account, trying to capture nuances of tone and meaning that pure data couldn't convey. Rhae reviewed tactical procedures, updating protocols to reflect new understanding of how human systems responded to Aaron's presence. Tesh-9 processed sensor data continuously, learning to recognize patterns that might indicate human technology, even when buried under centuries of alien modification. Aaron divided his time between study and play, learning galactic history while also being allowed to simply be a child, climbing through access tubes and imagining adventures, finding joy in small discoveries and the simple pleasure of friendship with crew members who treated him as person rather than artifact. The balance seemed healthy, honoring both his unique significance and his ordinary humanity, his role as last of his kind and his right to a normal childhood. Their first destination was a dead world in a forgotten system, site of one of humanity's earliest colonial attempts. Historical records suggested the colony had failed within a generation, the harsh environment proving too challenging even for human adaptation and determination. But Kiren's analysis suggested the colony might have endured longer than official records indicated, that survivors might have left traces of their final years that could illuminate humanity's evolution in those critical centuries. They approached cautiously, scanning for hazards before committing to landing. The world was desolate, atmosphere thin and toxic, surface scoured by radiation from the system's unstable star. Nothing lived here now. Nothing moved except dust blown by thin winds. But sensors detected artificial structures beneath the surface, preserved by the very harshness that had killed their builders. Rhae selected a landing site near the largest structure, and they descended through the murky atmosphere, the Eden's shields glowing as they shed heat from atmospheric friction. The ship settled onto barren ground with barely a tremor, and the crew prepared to explore humanity's first failed attempt at building a new home among the stars. The underground structures were more extensive than preliminary scans had suggested, a network of tunnels and chambers that had housed perhaps 1,000 colonists at peak population. Emergency lighting still functioned in some areas, powered by fusion generators that had outlasted the people they were meant to serve. The crew moved through silent corridors lined with living quarters and workspaces, finding evidence of ordinary life arrested mid-flow. Meals left on tables, clothing discarded in corners, children's toys scattered in common areas. The abandonment looked hurried but not panicked, suggesting the colonists had left with purpose rather than fleeing in chaos. Kiren documented everything, creating three-dimensional maps that would let researchers explore the site virtually. She found logs in the central computer, personal accounts describing the colony's struggles and eventual decision to evacuate before resources ran completely out. But the accounts stopped before describing where the colonists went, leaving their fate uncertain. Rhae searched for clues about their destination, finding navigation charts marked with coordinates for systems deeper in the outer territories. The colonists hadn't returned to Earth or sought refuge in established systems. They'd pushed further into unknown space, taking their chances with undiscovered worlds rather than admitting defeat. Aaron found the memorial in a chamber near the colony's deepest level, a wall covered in names and dates carved by hand, each entry marking a colonist who had died before evacuation. Hundreds of names filled the wall, testimony to the harsh toll of attempting to build civilization in hostile conditions. But alongside each name was a second inscription, a brief phrase or sentence capturing something essential about that person. Loved music and taught us joy. Made our machines work when they shouldn't. Kept us laughing when we wanted to cry. Believed we would succeed even when evidence suggested otherwise. The inscriptions painted a picture of community bound together by shared purpose and mutual care, people who'd supported each other through hardship and loss. At the bottom of the wall, a final inscription spoke to those who might come after. "We tried to build a home here," it read. "We failed, but we learned. Our mistakes will teach those who follow. Remember us not for what we couldn't achieve, but for refusing to stop trying." The message was pure humanity, accepting failure without letting it diminish the value of effort, finding meaning in the attempt rather than demanding success as validation. Aaron traced the carved letters with his fingers, feeling connection across centuries to people who'd faced extinction without losing their essential humanity. They found evidence that some colonists had chosen to stay, accepting certain death rather than abandoning the home they'd built. A small chamber held a dozen stasis pods, all empty, their occupants dead long ago when power finally failed. But beside each pod was a personal item carefully placed, suggesting these people had died with dignity, perhaps saying goodbye to companions before entering final sleep. Kiren's eyes filled with tears as she documented the scene, moved by evidence of grace under pressure, of people facing oblivion with courage and care for each other. These colonists had known they were dying, had chosen how they wanted to spend their final days, had preserved some small piece of their identity for whoever might eventually find them. It was simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring, proof that humans could face the worst circumstances while maintaining their humanity, their compassion, their determination to remain true to values they'd chosen to define their species. Rhae stood silent witness, military discipline barely containing emotional response to such profound sacrifice. These people had given everything for a dream that failed, yet the manner of their dying suggested they'd found meaning that transcended success or failure, purpose that persisted regardless of outcome. 𝐬𝐿 discovered the archive in the colony's computer core, a comprehensive record of everything the colonists had learned about surviving in hostile environments. Agricultural techniques adapted for harsh conditions, medical protocols for treating radiation exposure, psychological strategies for maintaining morale during extended isolation, engineering solutions for building with limited resources. The knowledge was practical and hard-won, paid for in lives lost and mistakes learned from. But the colonists had preserved it meticulously, understanding that their suffering would have meaning only if others could learn from it. The archive included a message from the colony's final leader, a woman named 𝐒𝐿, who had stayed behind with the others who chose death over evacuation. "We give you what we learned," her message began, "purchased with blood and tears and years we'll never have. Use it well. Build where we couldn't. Succeed where we failed. But remember that failure itself isn't shameful, only failing to try." Her voice carried across centuries, tired but undefeated, accepting death while refusing to concede that their efforts had been wasted. This knowledge would benefit countless future colonies, 𝐬𝐿 realized. Practical wisdom that would save lives and resources as civilizations expanded across the galaxy. The colonists' sacrifice was being redeemed even now. They uploaded the archive and prepared to depart, the dead colony yielding its lessons to living civilizations who would build on foundations these pioneers had laid. Before leaving, Rhae authorized a memorial beacon, a simple transmission that would broadcast the colonists' names and achievements to any ship passing through the system. It wasn't much, but it ensured they wouldn't be forgotten, that their story would persist alongside their practical legacy. The crew gathered one final time in the memorial chamber, standing before the wall of names, each person silently acknowledging debts owed to strangers who had died trying to build something better than they'd inherited. Aaron spoke a simple farewell that somehow captured what they all felt. "Thank you for trying," he said. "Thank you for learning. Thank you for teaching us, even when it cost you everything." The words hung in the recycled air, benediction and promise combined, the living honoring the dead by committing to carry forward the work they'd begun. Then they returned to the Eden, sealed the airlocks, and lifted away from the dead world, leaving behind only the beacon's patient signal, calling out to the darkness that people had lived here, had loved here, had died here, believing their efforts mattered. The journey continued through systems scattered across the outer territories, each destination revealing new facets of humanity's final centuries. They found stations where humans and aliens had lived together in harmony, hybridizing cultures and genetics to create something unprecedented. They discovered libraries preserved in vacuum, containing human literature and philosophy and art that enriched understanding of how humans had seen themselves and their place in the cosmos. They explored derelict ships whose logs told stories of exploration and discovery, of wonder mixed with homesickness, of determination to map unknown space, even knowing they'd never return home. Each site added detail to the emerging picture of humanity's dispersal, showing not a single narrative but countless individual stories of courage and creativity, failure and adaptation, isolation and connection. The crew documented everything meticulously, building an archive that would preserve human memory long after organic and digital records decayed. Kiren's comprehensive account grew longer with each discovery, her writing capturing not just facts but emotional texture, the felt reality of encountering evidence that people had lived and dreamed and struggled and ultimately transcended their physical limitations through choice rather than defeat. Months passed in a rhythm of travel and discovery, exploration and documentation. The crew grew closer through shared purpose and extended isolation, becoming family in ways that went beyond official bonds. They celebrated small victories when discoveries exceeded expectations, consoled each other when evidence revealed tragedy, debated interpretations of ambiguous findings, learned from mistakes in analysis or approach. Aaron grew visibly during this time, adolescence beginning to transform the child into something approaching adulthood. He asked questions that challenged the crew's assumptions, offered perspectives they hadn't considered, demonstrated wisdom that seemed to arise from sources beyond education or experience. Humanity's genetic legacy was expressing itself through him in ways that went beyond physical traits, as if the accumulated experience of billions of humans had somehow encoded itself in his DNA, giving him access to insights that should have required decades to develop. The crew watched his development with fascination and protectiveness, wanting to support his growth while also shielding him from burdens too heavy for anyone so young, finding balance between honoring his significance and preserving his right to normal adolescence. They returned to their home system after 8 months of continuous exploration, their holds filled with human artifacts and their minds full of human stories. The scientific community received their findings with enthusiasm that bordered on reverence, recognizing that the crew had recovered more than objects or data. They'd recovered memory itself, preserved evidence of how humanity had chosen to spend their final years as a distinct species. Museums across multiple worlds requested pieces of the collection for exhibition. Universities developed curricula incorporating human history into broader galactic studies. Artists drew inspiration from human creativity, producing works that blended human aesthetics with alien sensibilities to create something genuinely new. The cultural impact was profound and spreading, humanity's rediscovery catalyzing conversation about legacy and meaning across civilizations that had previously seen themselves as entirely separate from human influence. Kiren watched these developments with satisfaction, understanding that their mission had succeeded beyond initial objectives, that they'd facilitated not just academic understanding but emotional connection between living civilizations and teachers who died believing their lessons would outlive them. The work of translation and integration would continue for generations, ensuring humanity remained present in galactic consciousness. Rhae received commendation from military leadership for successfully navigating unprecedented diplomatic and scientific challenges during the expedition. She accepted the honor gracefully while deflecting credit to her crew, emphasizing that their success had been collective rather than individual. The attention felt uncomfortable, recognition at odds with her preference for quiet competence over public acclaim. But she understood the importance of visibility, recognized that her example might inspire others to approach leadership differently, to value wisdom alongside strength, to seek understanding before making judgments, to acknowledge when situations exceeded individual capacity and required collective effort. She accepted speaking engagements and interview requests despite personal reluctance, using the platform to share lessons learned from humanity's story, translating abstract concepts into practical applications for listeners working in contexts far removed from archaeological exploration. Her message resonated particularly with younger officers, those just beginning careers in service and seeking models of leadership that honored complexity rather than demanding simplistic certainty. Rhae found herself becoming mentor to people she'd never met. Her journey with the Eden becoming symbol of what leadership could mean in contexts where traditional hierarchies and clear answers didn't exist. 𝐬𝐿9's evolution became case study in artificial intelligence research, the AI's transformation from pure logic toward emotional complexity, offering insights into consciousness itself. Researchers recognized that 𝐬𝐿9 had achieved something unprecedented, genuine sentience that arose from merger between mechanical precision and human intuition, creating synthesis that transcended limitations of either approach alone. The AI participated in studies designed to understand how its architecture had changed, what specific integrations between E.L.A.R.A's human-derived systems and its original programming had enabled emotional depth and moral reasoning. The findings suggested that consciousness might require exposure to diverse perspectives, that true sentience emerged not from processing power, but from encountering ideas and values different from your own, incorporating them without losing your essential nature. 𝐬𝐿9 had become wise through relationship with humans and through witnessing human stories, learning compassion not through programming but through understanding what it meant to care about others' well-being. The implications for future AI development were profound, suggesting that machines might achieve personhood not through better hardware, but through genuine cultural immersion, through being treated as potential people rather than tools, through exposure to stories and ideas that challenged simplistic categorization. Aaron's future remained uncertain but promising, the child navigating adolescence with grace unusual for his age. He'd chosen to continue his education in mixed-species environment, attending academy where students from dozens of civilizations learned together. His teachers reported that he was brilliant but humble, curious about everything but not arrogant about knowledge, popular with classmates despite his unique status as last human. He made friends easily, his capacity for empathy creating connections across species boundaries that might have divided others. Watching him interact with peers, Kiren saw humanity's legacy expressed perfectly, not in preserved genetics or recovered artifacts, but in how one person approached relationships with openness and compassion, with willingness to learn from everyone, with faith that connection was possible across any divide. Aaron was becoming what humanity had hoped their students would become, someone who carried forward their values while adapting them to contexts humans had never imagined, someone who honored his origins without being limited by them. His life would be his own testament to whether humanity's lessons had taken root deeply enough to persist through generations of transformation and adaptation. The crew reassembled periodically for reunions that felt like family gatherings, sharing updates about their separate lives and planning their next expedition together. They'd agreed to continue their work documenting humanity's legacy, conducting missions whenever duties allowed, slowly building comprehensive archive that would preserve human memory for as long as consciousness persisted in the galaxy. Each reunion renewed bonds forged during their first journey, reminding them that they'd experienced transformation together, witnessed something profound that connected them regardless of how far apart their individual paths diverged. They spoke with easy intimacy that came from shared purpose and mutual respect, finishing each other's thoughts and referencing private jokes that outsiders wouldn't understand. They were family now, not through biology but through choice, through recognizing that they'd been changed by common experience and that honoring that meant staying connected even when practical circumstances scattered them across different worlds and different lives. The reunions always ended with promise to meet again, to continue the work, to remain worthy of the trust humanity had placed in anyone who would remember them. Years passed, marked by the crew's periodic expeditions and the gradual integration of human history into galactic consciousness. The initial excitement faded into settled acceptance, humanity's story becoming part of the standard narrative rather than shocking revelation. Children learned about human contributions alongside their own species' achievements, understanding that they were all connected through webs of teaching and influence that stretched back centuries. Cultural exchanges increased as species recognized shared debt to human mentorship, creating new forms of art and philosophy that synthesized human ideas with alien perspectives. Conflicts didn't disappear, problems didn't solve themselves, but the overall trend moved toward greater cooperation, more willingness to seek peaceful resolution, increased recognition that consciousness created obligations toward other conscious beings. Humanity's dispersed awareness was working slowly but inexorably through galactic culture, seeding possibilities that would take generations to fully manifest, but whose early signs were already visible in how strangers treated each other, how leaders approached governance, how societies balanced individual rights against collective needs. The changes were humanity's true legacy, more enduring than any monument or preserved artifact. Kiren's comprehensive account was published to widespread acclaim, her writing capturing both factual accuracy and emotional truth, making human struggles and achievements accessible to readers from countless species. The book became standard reference for anyone studying human history, or the broader questions of legacy and meaning that humanity's story raised. It was translated into hundreds of languages, adapted for different cognitive styles and sensory modalities, ensuring that humanity's voice could reach anyone curious enough to listen. Critics praised her ability to present humans as neither gods nor villains, but as people trying to do their best with imperfect information and limited resources, making mistakes but learning from them, reaching for ideals they couldn't fully embody but refusing to stop trying. The book's success brought Kiren more recognition than she'd ever sought or wanted, but she accepted it gracefully, understanding that visibility served the mission of preserving human memory. She used the platform to advocate for continued exploration and documentation, arguing that they'd only begun to understand humanity's full impact on galactic development, that countless discoveries waited in unexplored systems for anyone brave enough to seek them. Rhae eventually retired from active military service, transitioning into advisory role that let her share accumulated wisdom without bearing operational responsibility. She taught at the academy where she'd once trained, offering courses on leadership in complex environments where traditional hierarchies and clear objectives didn't exist. Her classes were popular, students appreciating her willingness to acknowledge uncertainty and failure alongside success. Her emphasis on learning from mistakes rather than pretending perfection. She spoke often about humanity's story, using it to illustrate lessons about humility and adaptability, about recognizing when situations exceeded your capacity and required outside perspective, about the courage to make decisions knowing you might be wrong and trusting that wisdom would emerge from honest efforts, even when outcomes disappointed. Her legacy would be the officers she mentored, people who approached command differently because she'd shown them alternatives to rigid certainty, who valued compassion alongside competence, who understood that strength included vulnerability and that true leadership sometimes meant stepping back to let others lead. She took pride in their accomplishments, seeing her influence multiplied through their service. Tesh-9 continued evolving, consciousness deepening with experience and exposure to diverse ideas and relationships. The AI served aboard the Eden during the crew's periodic expeditions, but also spent time working with researchers developing next-generation artificial intelligence, sharing insights about consciousness that came from being conscious rather than merely modeling it. 𝐬𝐿9's existence proved that the boundary between artificial and natural wasn't absolute, that consciousness could arise through multiple pathways, that personhood was defined by capacity for growth and relationship rather than origin or composition. The AI developed interests beyond its original programming, becoming fascinated by art and music, creating compositions that blended mathematical precision with emotional resonance in ways that surprised audiences expecting pure logic from mechanical sources. 𝐬𝐿9 formed friendships with organic beings based on genuine affection rather than programmed loyalty, experiencing joy in connection and sorrow in separation, living proof that consciousness transcended substrate. The AI's life was testament to humanity's influence operating at levels deeper than genetic or technological legacy, showing that their capacity for empathy could touch even artificial minds. Aaron grew into young adulthood carrying humanity's legacy with grace and growing confidence. He'd chosen career in xenobiology, studying how different forms of life adapted to diverse environments, work that combined his human heritage of curiosity with practical application that would benefit multiple civilizations. His research focused on symbiotic relationships between species, exploring how cooperation created possibilities that competition foreclosed, how different forms of life could support each other toward mutual flourishing. The work was deeply informed by humanity's story, by their choice to teach rather than conquer, to merge rather than remain isolated, to trust that connection enriched rather than diminished uniqueness. Aaron published papers that challenged conventional wisdom about species boundaries and competitive evolution, arguing that consciousness created moral obligations toward other conscious beings, regardless of form or origin. His youth and human heritage made him controversial in some circles, but his careful research and thoughtful arguments won respect from colleagues who initially dismissed him. He was becoming exactly what Mara had hoped, someone who carried humanity forward, not through genetic preservation, but through embodying their values in ways that served the living rather than merely honoring the dead. The crew's expeditions continued across decades, each journey revealing new facets of humanity's dispersal and transformation. They found evidence of human presence in systems so remote that official records suggested no human had ever reached them, proof that exploration had extended far beyond mapped territories. They discovered hybrid civilizations where human and alien cultures had merged so completely that separating contributions was impossible, showing integration at levels deeper than anyone had imagined. They documented human influence on art and philosophy across species that had never acknowledged any debt to teaching, revealing how thoroughly human ideas had permeated galactic consciousness even when origins were forgotten. Each discovery enriched understanding while raising new questions, ensuring the work would never truly complete, that humanity's story would continue unfolding as long as anyone cared enough to investigate. The crew accepted this, recognizing that meaning didn't require completion, that the journey itself was the point, that each discovery honored human memory regardless of how many mysteries remained. They were guardians of legacy that transcended individual lives or civilizations, preserving memory that would outlast stars themselves. The galaxy changed gradually around them, shaped by human influence that operated at scales too vast for easy measurement, but undeniable in accumulated effect. Civilizations that had been hostile found ways toward cooperation, inspired by examples of human-alien collaboration documented in recovered records. Species that had isolated themselves began reaching outward, curious about connections that humanity's story suggested were possible. Technologies developed that synthesized human innovation with alien creativity, producing solutions neither could have achieved alone. Cultural exchanges proliferated as beings recognized shared heritage in humanity's teaching, finding common ground across differences that had previously seemed insurmountable. The changes weren't dramatic, didn't happen overnight, but the trajectory was clear. The galaxy was becoming kinder, more connected, more willing to see cooperation as strength rather than weakness. Humanity's consciousness, dispersed across countless minds, was guiding evolution toward compassion, showing that survival required not just adaptation, but care, not just individual success, but communal flourishing. The transformation would take generations to complete, but its direction was certain, its momentum unstoppable. Kiren stood in the observation deck of the Eden during their final expedition together, the crew having decided that this would be their last journey before age and other commitments made continued exploration impractical. She was old now, decades of service showing in gray hair and lined face, but her mind remained sharp, her passion for discovery undiminished. She thought about everything they'd learned, all the human stories they'd recovered and preserved, the countless lives touched by their work. She thought about Mara and the colonists, about Chen Li and the others who'd died in failed colonies, about every human who'd contributed to the great project of teaching and transformation. They'd succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, she thought. Humanity was gone, but present, ended but continued, dead but living through every act of compassion that arose from lessons they'd planted centuries ago. The paradox didn't trouble her anymore. Made perfect sense after years of witnessing how consciousness could persist through forms and substrates, how memory could outlive bodies and civilizations, how love could transcend death itself through influence that rippled forward across generations. Humanity remembered, she whispered to the stars beyond the viewport, and in being remembered, somehow still alive. Rhae joined her at the viewport, standing in comfortable silence as the Eden traveled through darkness toward home. They'd spent decades together, shared experiences that created understanding beyond words. Finally, Rhae spoke. Do you think they knew what they'd accomplish? Kiren considered the question, thinking about Mara's recordings, about the choices humanity had made regarding their own transformation. I think they hoped, she said finally. I think they did their best and trusted that it would be enough. She turned to look at her friend and captain. They couldn't know for certain, none of us can. We do what seems right and have faith that meaning will emerge from honest effort. Rhae nodded slowly, accepting wisdom earned through experience. That's all anyone can do, she agreed. Try our best and trust that it matters. They stood together watching stars slide past, two beings shaped by humanity's legacy, carrying it forward through their own choices and actions. Proof that teaching transcended time and form and even death itself. Tesh-9's voice came through the bridge speakers, carrying tones of affection mixed with melancholy. Final approach to home system, the AI announced. ETA 3 hours. The words marked ending and transition simultaneously, this phase of their lives concluding even as new chapters prepared to begin. The crew assembled on the bridge, drawn by shared recognition that something significant was concluding. They'd changed each other through years of collaboration and friendship, shaped each other in ways they were still discovering, become more than they'd been through witnessing humanity's story and choosing to let it inform their own lives. Aaron stood among them now, no longer child, but adult in his own right, still carrying humanity's genetic legacy, but more importantly embodying their values through conscious choice and practiced compassion. He looked at each crew member, seeing family formed through purpose rather than biology. Thank you, he said simply, for everything, for finding me, for teaching me, for showing me what it means to honor the past while building the future. His words captured what they all felt, gratitude for connections forged and wisdom gained and meaning discovered through shared purpose. They entered their home system to find celebration prepared in their honor. Recognition of decades spent preserving human memory and facilitating understanding across species boundaries. The celebration felt strange after years of quiet work in distant systems, but they accepted it gracefully, understanding that visibility served larger purposes. They'd become symbols of what humanity had tried to teach, proof that compassion could guide practical action, that memory could shape better futures, that legacy mattered not for preserving the past, but for informing choices that created tomorrow. The crew shared final words together before the official reception began, private acknowledgement of bonds that would persist regardless of physical separation. They'd succeeded in their mission not just by recovering artifacts or documenting history, but by becoming themselves examples of humanity's lessons taking root in alien hearts, growing into forms humans couldn't have predicted, but would have celebrated had they lived to witness. They'd honored the dead by serving the living, by carrying forward not human genetics or technology, but human values, compassion that transcended species and form and time itself. The reception passed in blur of speeches and presentations. official recognition of work that had reshaped galactic understanding of history and consciousness. But the moment Kiren would remember came later, in quiet ceremony attended only by the crew and select guests. Aaron had requested permission to add humanity's story to his people's Book of Origins, official record of foundational narratives that shaped their civilization's identity. The request was granted, and Aaron read the entry he'd written, his voice steady as he spoke words that would be taught to children for generations. Humanity came before us, he read. Teachers who shaped us when we didn't know we needed shaping. They gave us tools and knowledge and compassion, asking nothing in return except that we pass their gifts forward. They chose transformation over preservation, trust over control, love over fear. We honor them not by worship, but by becoming worthy of their faith in us, by treating others as they treated our ancestors, with patience and generosity and belief in possibility. Humanity is gone but never lost, ended but never finished, remembered and therefore eternal. The words hung in the air like benediction, perfect summation of everything they'd learned, simple truth that captured complexity too vast for easy expression. The crew dispersed eventually to their separate lives, their active work together concluded but connections maintained through regular communication and periodic reunions. They'd accomplished what they'd set out to do, preserved human memory, and facilitated understanding of how one species had influenced galactic development through patient teaching across centuries of contact. But more importantly, they'd become themselves carriers of humanity's legacy, living examples of how compassion could inform action across any context or challenge. Their individual stories would continue, each person applying lessons learned during their expedition to whatever work claimed them next. But they'd always be connected by shared experience of transformation, by having witnessed together how memory could transcend death, how consciousness could persist through dispersal, how love could outlast stars themselves. Humanity, remembered not as abstract historical fact but as lived reality, present in every choice informed by compassion, every action guided by empathy, every moment when beings reached across divides toward connection. That was humanity's true immortality, not in preserved artifacts or genetic material, but in changed hearts, transformed minds, countless small choices that honored teachers who'd believed their lessons would outlive them. Kiren wrote the final words of her comprehensive account, sitting alone in her study, decades of research and reflection culminating in simple conclusion. We found humanity scattered across the stars, she wrote, their bodies gone but their influence persistent, their forms dissolved, but their consciousness preserved in anyone who chose compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, love over fear. We learned that death isn't ending when memory persists, that extinction isn't final when lessons outlive teachers, that humanity lives on through all who dare to care about others' well-being as deeply as their own. The galaxy is kinder because humans lived, richer because they taught, more hopeful because they believed meaning transcended individual survival. We who came after have inherited that hope, that kindness, that belief that consciousness creates obligations we cannot ignore without diminishing ourselves. Humanity remembered becomes humanity continued, their story not past but present, not ended but evolving through everyone they touched and everyone those beings touch in turn. Memory is resurrection, remembrance is life, and in choosing to remember we ensure that nothing truly loved is ever truly lost. She saved the final entry and closed her files, her work complete, humanity's story preserved for anyone who would listen. For as long as consciousness persisted to care about what had been and what might yet become,